Hello, I'm Anavultus, and welcome to the Anavultus show. Today, I'm here with a very special guest. I was on his show recently. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, yes, I'm Wyatt Berckenhoff. I'm the Breakdown with Berckenhoff, and yeah.
Yep. So today we're here to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the election and presumably our impressions of what has happened and what may likely happen in the future. As it seems that even though the popular election itself is over, we're not quite over with the rest of some developing events.
Yeah,
So-
it's definitely not over. Yeah, it's definitely not over as far as election goes.
Yeah, we are in a relatively unusual position, although it's not 100% unprecedented. But let's say we're in a position somewhat similar to 2000, where Bush v. Gore happened, and where in a number of states the election was very close. So currently there are recounts going on, but what I think is different from what happened last time is that although Biden is on top and there are recounts going on, we are in a situation where there are certain allegations of funny business going on. And I'm using the term funny business because I don't want to get censored on YouTube. But essentially, there are some strong allegations, and this happens to some extent in every election. However, in this case, we're getting a flood of whistleblowers coming out, and that's a relatively unusual situation.
Yeah, it's the fraud itself is obviously both ways. Like I haven't heard too much examples of like Republican fraud so far, but I'm sure it exists. It's overwhelmed with the opposite right now because Trump is suing states and all that. But as you were just saying, it's odd to see people come out. It's odd to see it being almost this obvious, because there was definitely some manipulation being done.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily obvious, but what I am saying is that we're having much more substantial claims than are usually occurring. I think that's a better way to put it, because I think in the process of our legal system, we want the courts to examine evidence that people are submitting and examine that evidence in the light of our legal system and justice overall. Now, that being said, full disclosure here, before anyone thinks I'm a Trump shill or anything like that, I did not vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I voted for a different candidate, and because of that, I don't really have skin in the game 100% on which candidate wins from a partisan perspective. However, I will say that obviously which candidate wins is important for the country as a whole. So because of how important it is, how important the election is, I think it's very important that when people are making such allegations of funny business going on, that we do take it seriously. Because people are saying, well, it might be people coping with losing the election. It might be a situation where people are just upset they lost, so they start calling foul. What is your perspective on that take?
I think there is definitely some truth for people that just don't necessarily want to accept defeat, especially with this election, because I've only got to vote twice now, but even talking to people who have gotten to vote, numerous times, they're saying that this one is very divided between who you vote for. So if you're voting for Joe, you think this way. If you're voting for Trump, you think this way. And there's not really that much in between that exists going into this election. So the people who are, I would say, avid supporters for Trump in this case, are probably not going to want to accept defeat, so they're just going to believe it without really looking at the evidence. So I do think that there is a lot of that going on.
Yes, I agree on that perspective. And I will say that one thing that's important to note, something that in many ways needs to be addressed and should not be forgotten, is the idea that even if this is not fake, even if it ends up being insubstantial, even if these allegations don't end up leading anywhere, the fact that these allegations themselves exist merits at least some investigation, because if these allegations are true on that hypothesis, and the fact that there's people coming out saying that they're true, if these allegations are true, could, in theory, undermine our political system completely if it is not dealt with. So it's important for us to have confidence in our system, and by going through these investigations, we will be able to either build confidence in our system or understand where our confidence has been misplaced and therefore fix our system so that we can have confidence in it.
Right. Yeah, you definitely don't want. What I've been hearing a lot, I guess is the easiest way to put this. What I've been hearing a lot is you don't want whoever wins to be uh, where you don't really believe they won legitimately. You know what I mean? You want to make sure that the fraud is reduced enough, because there's still probably going to be some fraud no matter what you do, because the election system is not free of that. But anyway, long story short, you want the person that ends up being president to be someone that the majority of America thinks won fairly.
Yes, and I think that's very important, at least in the context of our country. Now, one thing I will say is that I think Trump made a big mistake by sending lawsuits out right away, because that leads to a situation where a lot of these early lawsuits that Trump made have already been struck down. So we're in a situation where, in some ways, it can feel like a boy who cried wolf. I think what Trump should have done, if he wanted to dispute this, is he should have waited a bit before entering the dispute and actually gathered evidence, launched an investigation, etc. And so, but he immediately sent out a bunch of lawsuits, and a lot of them ended up not going anywhere. So obviously, if Trump wants to question the validity of the election in certain states, he needs to actually have evidence proving that there was some sort of malfeasance, negligence, or mistake in some way.
Right. Yeah. That's the least you need in order for it to be accepted in the system, court system. But yeah, I didn't really think about that idea as far as waiting, because I think in general Trump wanted to go as fast as possible to kind of show his supporters that it was unfair right away. But if you take more, and this is take more of a legal strategy, gathering evidence is more important than going fast. Is kind of what I took from that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the reason he went right away did indeed have to do with his publicity and public support, and and obviously it would be a bit weird if Trump didn't say anything and also didn't concede, and the election was over. He didn't question it right away and didn't concede, but of course he could have questioned it and then waited a bit, gathering evidence before filing lawsuits.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Because if you, I don't know exactly how it works in regards of filing again under new evidence, but it certainly is a more awkward situation, I presume. Now, in regards to continue.
No, go on, go on.
In regards to the actual allegations that there are a bunch of different allegations, and I'm certain that some of them, and indeed many of them, are probably overblown. There might be people who see more legitimate allegations, and then they try to examine and they find various things, such as Sharpiegate, I think, is one example, where the allegation was that votes filled in with Sharpie didn't count when in fact they did. And I think that's a huge point to make, that it's very important to be very careful in regards to what you take as evidence, and also what you take as a legitimate criticism of the process, because there are certain things that people might not understand about the process, and there's also certain things that people putting out rumors can get very big. And that's why I understand that there are people in social media trying to censor the questions in regards to the validity of election. But I do think that regardless of that, we need to have a discussion on these issues.
Yeah, I would say you're going to get all sorts of claims right away because you're going to have the people that try to get, their 15 seconds of fame too, I would think. Now, when you have tons of people saying one thing, it becomes a little different. But I've heard about the Sharpie Gate or whatever you want to nickname that when in Arizona, but I didn't hear like the aftermath of it, so I didn't know that that was like the actual process uh, in that state or in the entire system. But that being said, I do think that you have a lot of people that come out and say something just to try to get on the good side of the president or maybe have their fame. But there's just a lot of claims that get made or like you were saying earlier that don't necessarily understand the process. So it may seem bizarre, but that state has that as their way of doing it.
Yeah. I think another thing to point out is statistical anomalies. And I'm not talking about the idea of over 100% voter turnout, because that's obviously something where something went wrong there. But I'm talking about places where people see strange curves in number distributions and where voting patterns are different. And I'd like to point out that this is not evidence of cheating. Statistical anomalies are not direct evidence of cheating. I want to make that very clear. Statistical anomalies, however, are considered to be anomalies for the purpose of examining when something went wrong. For example, if something happens and is weird, in regards to, let's say, a criminal investigation where something weird happens, something highly unusual, you would want to investigate that, even if it in itself is not evidence, because it is something that could lead to evidence. So when there's a statistical anomaly, it doesn't mean that there necessarily is something wrong, but it does mean that there probably is something that should be examined.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that approach. Like statistics themselves aren't 100% true, despite it being statistics. I mean, you can even take like political statistics with like polling, which is a type of statistic, I guess you could say. And you saw how wrong polling can be, for example. Now, obviously, those are a little bit different when you're looking into like election numbers, but it's the same general concept. Statistics aren't 100% true by any means.
Yeah, and of course there can also be a lot of manipulation of statistics that people can make. People can take statistics and read them 100 different ways. So it's very important to take statistics with a grain of salt. Now, that being said, I'd like to move on to a bit of a different topic on what happens from here. Uh, Trump is making lawsuits, and as John from GenGap, who's commenting right now, pointed out, lawsuits can sometimes take some time to go through the courts. So what Trump is presumably hoping for is a situation where either there is a favorable recount for him that leads him to win the election, or certain states' elections are considered to be invalidated by a court, which then leads to Biden not having enough electors to gain a majority, leading to the vote going to the House of Representatives, voting by state delegation to elect the president, in which case Trump has a high chance of winning. And I think that's something that's very important to point out, that Trump, if it goes to the House of Representatives, has an extremely high chance of winning the election. And for this reason, you'd expect to see very strong partisan opposition to Trump's questioning of the electoral results, because if Trump is successful in delegitimizing Biden's election, then Trump, in theory, has an extremely high chance of winning. But something I'd like to point out here is that situation only happens if Trump manages to get either a favorable recount or invalidate the elections in a number of states. Because, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a law that says that the electors, because the actual election happens in December, the electors can't vote based on questioned information. Because in previous elections where we've had to go to the House of Representatives, it was a situation where no one had a majority of electors backing him, which then led to going to the House of Representatives. But we're in a situation where if things continue as they are currently, if the election stands as it currently stands, then there will be someone with a majority, that is Joe Biden in this instance, and while the election is disputed in the court, it could proceed to a point where the election day, the actual election day, comes up, and based on the popular votes in the states, because people say the popular votes don't matter, but they do matter in the sense that they influence the voting of the electors, and in many states the electors are required to vote in regards of the state's popular vote. So if the election day comes and the electors don't have a reason not to vote for Biden, they will vote for Biden, in which case you can end up in a situation where the election is still disputed while Biden still proceeds down the process of becoming president, which was a weird situation, a very unusual situation. So Trump's current goal is that within the next month, he has to delegitimize Biden's victory. That's Trump's current legal goal. Now, in regards to the questions of how long is this going to take in court, we don't know. It depends on how much evidence Trump can find within a month and which courts take up the decisions. And as people had said, because of the magnitude of the case that this would be, it is likely that the Supreme Court would take up this decision.
I definitely think the end goal is going to be the Supreme Court for sure. Like, what I've heard from a lot of people is that Trump is trying to win recounts in each state, but I don't necessarily see the way the map is now, Trump being able to turn all the states to win outright through, the electoral vote. So I do think that, and I may be misunderstanding the process too, but I do think his goal, like you were saying, is to basically delegitimize the election as a whole. And I don't know too much about law itself to know how that would be done through each step, but I do know that most likely the end goal is going to be the Supreme Court.
Yes, and I think that Trump's strategy of going for a recount, if he's alleging that there was malfeasance, then a recount is not very likely to give him the results
votes,
that he's expecting. Because if bad votes were cast and a recount occurs, then they might just simply recount the same bad votes that were cast. And that wouldn't actually help him in that situation. So, and that's, of course, ignoring the fact that Project Veritas has already uncovered a situation in Pennsylvania where people were dumping spoilt ballots. And spoiled ballots are ballots that are considered illegitimate for the actual election, but they are required to be kept for a couple of different reasons, presumably. And that would be A, to determine that they were spoiled for the correct reason if the recount occurs, and B, to determine that there wasn't someone turning in multiple ballots, which is something that a spoiled ballot could indicate. So, in that sense, spoiled ballots are important for the recount, but because they were already being dumped in some parts of Pennsylvania, it leads to a situation where we can't actually rely on a recount because the recount itself has been spoiled, in essence, through the dumping of spoiled ballots.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I just don't see a process where Trump would be able to gain enough votes through a recount to win certain states. I do think some states are close enough where it could happen, but he would need, from my understanding, almost all of the states to be able to win the election. So I don't really see that idea happening. But I do know that there is several evidence of like dead people voting in Pennsylvania and poll watchers being denied being able to watch the process. And there's a lot of evidence coming out of Pennsylvania that the process there wasn't truthful.
Well, speaking of Pennsylvania, we actually have a named whistleblower that is talking about the backdating of ballots. His name is Richard Hopkins. He is a USPS worker. And there are similar allegations in Michigan of the same thing happening. And and because of this, we're in an interesting situation. Because if ballots are backdated, which is to say that a ballot came in late and therefore normally would be invalid for the election because it came after the deadline. If it is backdated, that is, it has the actual election day put on it, then it is counted as legitimate. Now, the problem with this is that one way to tell the difference in a recount between an on time and a late ballot is by looking at the date that is on it. Now, if the postal office itself is putting the wrong date on the ballots, then we do not have the means to have an accurate and valid count or recount of these ballots. And therefore, because the legitimate and the illegitimate ballots are indistinguishable, the logical course would be to invalidate all the mail ballots. Now, the problem is that Michigan has a lot of mail-in ballots, and that would essentially put a situation, and Pennsylvania as well, and that would put us in a situation where a lot of ballots that came in are invalidated, and therefore the vast majority of votes that were made become invalid, which, from an electoral perspective, is relatively bad because presumably most of these may be entirely legitimate ballots. And so this is a serious problem if this is happening in the postal office, because we now have a named whistleblower in Pennsylvania and an anonymous one in Michigan, that both saying the same thing. That is, that supervisors were telling the postal workers to put the wrong date on the ballots. And I'd like to add that the fact that this is happening in theory in two different states puts in the possibility of a larger conspiracy, perhaps in the Postal Workers Union or in the USPS. and that really puts a question on the reliability of our institutions.
Yeah, and this is from Project Veritas, is what you're quoting here, or because I
Yes.
thought I was hearing something. Yeah, yeah. I don't I don't necessarily see a process where the Melon ballots would be excluded from being counted, because there's just a lot of Melon ballots, and they were really pushing for the Melon ballots in the first place. So I don't see how you could do that. But we all know that the process of Melon balloting itself has many flaws. So the idea of having to rely on Melon ballots is a problem when that's your main source of voting and not, a secondary one.
Yeah. Well, the problem is if the real ballots and the well, I say real, if the legitimate ballots and the illegitimate ballots look the same because they've been dated the same, then we can't tell which ones are real and which ones are fake, which
Right.
leads to a situation where, in order to preserve the integrity of the election, we have to get rid of all of them, at least in the area where this is alleged to be happening.
Right. Right. And do you see do you see that happening? I guess would be the next question there.
Well, we now have a named whistleblower, which so it's no longer someone who's anonymous, someone who could be making stuff up. But obviously, the person could still be making stuff up. However, I think it's serious enough of an allegation that it needs to be investigated.
No, I definitely agree with that. Yeah. And from what I've heard from the Project Veritas, which I haven't listened to all of it by any means, but it does seem pretty legitimate evidence from his perspective.
Yeah. Now, on the hypothesis that there is funny business going on, I will say that there are three potential outcomes to this situation. If there is funny business going on, and and that is assuming a number of different factors. But the first situation, in which case Trump does not oppose Biden and simply concedes, and hypothetically, if there is funny business going on, then whatever funny business there is goes unchallenged and repeats itself, potentially over and over again, leading to a situation where we have an oligarchy where we have rigged elections, which is a situation that I hope we would all want to avoid. The second situation is Trump challenges this, but he challenges it in a way that is illegal or unconstitutional, or he does something that would undermine our laws and constitutions in challenging this. And if he does it that way, then the situation would be fixed, and we would have some short-term stability, but in the long term, we would be making a similar mistake to what the Romans made, and would eventually develop into a series of strongmen developing into a dictatorship as the president uses his power to try to fix the country. The third potential is that Trump fixes it, and he fixes it in a very lawful and constitutional way, and that leads to an opportunity for reform, an opportunity for our system to be maintained. And that's something that I hope is the outcome of this situation.
Yeah, I would think that everybody would hope the process is legitimate, because nobody really wants to vote for a president, or to have a president that you think is illegitimate or didn't actually win the election. In other words, be rigged. Because like you can take example of like Russia, where a lot of Russians were basically knew that Putin was going to end up winning his elections, even though he actually had a contender in the last one, and whatnot. So it's like you don't really want people to, or at least I wouldn't think here in the U.S. would want the same thing to happen here.
yeah, that ends up becoming a banana republic situation. So there are some people that are hoping that in opposing the election, Trump will essentially expose, in large part, things that may have been going on beneath the surface in our political system, and then that will lead to a renewal in our country of justice and order. So I saw a video by the prosecutor in regards to this, and he had that sort of idea that uh, by challenging the election, Trump could really lead us to a situation that would fix our country in many ways.
I would hope that that would be the end outcome,
Yeah.
but I don't know if I necessarily see it. But
Now proceeding on the hypothesis that there actually was no funny business, and that what we're seeing are false positives, and that the whistleblowers are either mistaken or lying. Under that hypothesis, then all that happens if Trump challenges it uh, is and challenges it legally, I say, is that he embarrasses himself somewhat, and our country moves on, and then we'll just have to live with Biden as president. So I think the downsides of challenging it under the hypothesis that there is funny business, uh, or sorry, I'm sorry, the downsides of not challenging it on the hypothesis of there is funny business are much greater than the downsides of not challenging it on the hypothesis that there is not funny business going on. So, and I'm not saying that that's something that should be taken equally, but what I am saying is that these allegations are significant enough that they merit an investigation, and that regardless of what we think is actually happening, we should at least have the investigation.
that is a very positive approach to take what's happening right now. And I also watched the prosecutor's video on what he was talking about too, and I do agree with what he had to say with that process too. But I don't know if I have. I don't know if I'm super optimistic with what's happening compared to what his approach was.
Yes, and obviously for Trump to be able to pull through this, he needs to uh, gather large amounts of evidence. He needs to sue the right people. He needs to get the Supreme Court to pick up the case, which I think they probably will due to the nature of what's going on here. The Supreme Court is likely to want to be interested in what's going on because it's something that's questioning the very future of our country. However, we will not be in a situation where we do not have a president simply because our country is set up under the principle that although we may have vacancies in the Supreme Court, although we may have vacancies in Congress sometimes, we are not allowed to have vacancies in the presidency. And therefore, we will have a president regardless of what happens. And ideally, we will have a president that favors law and order.
You would hope.
Yes,
I know
we
that
would
there
certainly
was.
hope.
Yeah, I
That's
know
why I
that
said
there was some.
ideally.
Yeah, yeah. I know there was some extreme example that I heard where like Nancy Pelosi would come president, and I was like, yeah, no, I don't necessarily see that happening. But
Well, the way Nancy Pelosi would become president is if either Biden and Harris or Trump and Pence win, but both of them are dead or incapacitated of the winning pair. And then Nancy Pelosi, as the Speaker of the House, uh, would become the president. And or acting president, depending on the situation. And then after that, you go down the line on a number of different positions. But ultimately, that would only happen if both the president and vice president are indisposed in some way. Now, the chances of that happening are relatively low because we can have a situation where one of them is indisposed, but let's say hypothetically one of them dies rather than being disabled in some way. Then, in the case of the president dying, the vice president becomes the president and then can appoint a vice president. Or in the case of the vice president dying, the president simply appoints a new vice president. So the situation of the Speaker of the House becoming the president is something that has never happened, but is hypothetically possible to happen, but is highly unlikely to happen.
Right, yeah.
So I think that if certain allegations are true in regards to the allegations of funny business, I will say that if these allegations are true, it is likely that Trump did indeed win the popular vote, if some of these allegations are true. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, to me, it just seems very suspicious what happened in a lot of these swing states, uh, and I think that Trump is the more popular candidate. So to think that he would win the popular vote does make sense. But even just looking at numbers and what was happening before I went to bed, it seemed like Trump had a pretty good handle at winning this popular vote. And then if you take what happened, well, as you say, funny business, I do think that there's a lot of fudged numbers that would suggest he did as well. So just off of what I think, or you could say my bias in general, and kind of evidence on what some people are saying, I do think that Trump probably did win the popular vote.
Yeah, and I expected that because the previous election was relatively narrow, and it was my perception that his popularity had increased. Now, of course, I could be wrong. I might have a very limited perspective on that, but as as I think is very fair to say at this point, is that actual election night was only the beginning of the election rather than the end of it.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. I know that people have bets on how long the actual election process is going to take, from 2 weeks to 2 months type of
Yeah,
thing.
and some people are noting that in regards if something happens going to the Supreme Court, that a lot of the justices in the Supreme Court were slighted in some ways by Biden or Harris, and ideally that doesn't go into their decision. However, it is worth noting that particular scenario.
I know a lot of people, especially Supreme Court, were saying that the reason they wanted to get Amy Coney Barrett. I almost said Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Anyway, Amy Coney Barrett was that she would be that positive vote to have uh, Trump get into office or to win the election because she's conservative or whatever you want to say for the justice, and that's why they tried to push it through. I know that there's a lot of that talking point going on too.
Yeah, certainly. Now, in regards to if Biden wins, and that is assuming that things proceed as they have proceeded currently. If nothing changes, that is, and Biden wins, then we have a situation where we could expect more from what we saw in the Obama presidency. And of course, one of the big problems in the Obama presidency, I think one of the big failings of it was the way in which the foreign policy affected the world, where we had a lot of funding for the Arab Spring, really exacerbating tensions throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and also thereby causing a big migrant crisis that ended up affecting Europe in a very negative way. And Biden is in the middle of all of this. So I think from that perspective, that is not a very bright future.
Not at all. No.
Yeah. So, in regards to the next election, which is something that I think is very important to note, is that how this is handled this year, how this particular election is handled, is a bit of a, you could say, turning point. Now, people might say it's a bit premature to say that from a historical perspective, but I think that the way in which the allegations of fraud are handled here, assuming they're true, is going to have a huge impact on the future of a political discourse in this country for the coming decades. So this is something that I think Trump needs to be very careful in what he does. He needs to be very careful in what he says, more so than ever before, if he wants to come out with a situation that is beneficial not only for his position but for the country as a whole.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. Because a lot of people who are more pro Trumpers than like want to vote for Trump, if that makes sense. You have your two sides there. The more people that are like super pro Trump, like my grandfather, he was saying that Trump wants to pass laws or to do things as the every American wants. So in other words, he is a pro-American president. So he wants to do something that when people look back at him are going to say, Trump was a great president. He kind of wants that stance. So he was telling me that he thinks Trump is going to do all the legal stuff necessary to to have a standard to go on from now on. So he's very much taking a positive approach to the what's going on legally. To kind of what you were saying there too.
Yeah, I see what he's saying there, and I do think that we are in a very tense situation because looking on Twitter, which probably is not most representative of the country, but is more representative of certain elements of the country. We see a lot of people hoping for Trump to concede, to concede, to concede, to concede. But if Trump is serious about these allegations, it would make absolutely no sense for him to concede.
Right. Yeah. If he's taking the serious approach and uh, not letting his ego get in the way of trying to do the legal proceedings. In other words, if he's taking an approach where he believes that these allegations are true and wants to make sure that America knows they're true for the system itself to get better, then you have that side of the approach. But then you have the other side where a lot of people are saying that the only reason Trump is doing this is uh, to win election again and to boost his ego. He's only doing it for himself and only thinking of himself through the process.
Yeah. I think that whatever Trump does, he needs to uphold the Constitution. He needs to respect due process. And I certainly hope he does not try to take matters into his own hands, although I do not think that he will. Let me be very clear on that. There's many people that have an idea that Trump would do a hostile takeover and simply refuse to leave the White House if he lost. I don't think Trump would do that.
I don't think so either. I think that's just people, I don't know what you would say, but over exaggerating claims, I guess you could say there. I think a lot of people just see Trump as being like a bullish person and not really thinking of America and just thinking of himself. And I do think there's some truth to that. Just look at his Twitter if you want examples. But I do think that Trump does have America on his mind more than people really think he does, especially on Twitter.
Yes, I certainly think that Trump is interested in keeping the prosperity for his country, at least in some ways, as we see his net worth actually dropped during his time in office, which is relatively rare. He didn't really make a lot of gains personally. He refused to take the salary of the president, and a meme was going around where a comparison was being made with various insults that have been laid against Trump compared to his actual policy positions. And because people say Trump is homophobic, he's anti-Semitic, he doesn't like veterans, he does various things, but then what he actually did is completely opposite to the accusations that are being laid against him. So I think we're in a situation where the media has villainized Trump. Now, I wouldn't say that all criticism of Trump is illegitimate, because I do have serious criticism against Trump, and that's why I didn't vote for him, among other things. But I think that a lot of the media has been very strongly biased against Trump throughout the entirety of the last 4 years. And this has, of course, led to a situation where we have these never ending problem that the media is looking for ways again and again to lead to delegitimize Trump's presidency from the very beginning. Now, that being said, it would be fair if they were equally critical of Joe Biden now that he won, but they simply aren't. And we see this in the fact that Russiagate, I think, is a huge example of this. That Trump's election is illegitimate because he received quid pro quo and support from the Russians, and therefore Trump isn't the legitimate president. Okay, that's a Russiagate position. Now, and now these allegations are based on a lot fewer and a lot more spurious evidence pieces than the ones that are currently being laid against Joe Biden in his winning of the election. So I think that it would be at least fair for people that supported Russiagate investigations to at least say that it's legitimate to look into what happened in this election cycle.
Yeah, that's why the whole thing, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but it has to do with the media and Twitter, with the not deletion but banning, I guess you would say, of the New York Post with their whole article about Hunter Biden's situation, and it just seems like media is not wanting to push certain components of people's stories when it doesn't fit their narrative, and obviously as a news organization, you're going to want to push what you believe. Because really, none of these news organizations are just talking about news. They all have their bias and what they're trying to push. But guess what I'm trying to say is you just saw clear censorship with that story on Twitter, and really all the major networks not really talking about the laptop or just the whole situation with Biden's son. And then you have Trump, and they're fully willing to attack Trump on even less claims like Russia. So, I mean, you're just not seeing equal distribution of stories.
Certainly. And that, of course, is a problem. And some people have alleged that this is part of a larger cultural trend of cultural institutions aligning themselves toward a particular position, which would be, I suppose, a progressive position, including critical theory, among other things. And people refer to this coalescing of cultural institutions as the cathedral, as coined by Kurt Yarvin. But it's a situation where if we don't have a trust in our election, and we don't have a trust in the media, and we don't have a trust in the system of education, we're in a pretty bad place, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely, definitely. That's the worst part about this whole election is just one, it shows clearly how divided we are as a country, and then two, the system of elections themselves are at stake.
Yeah. So we're in a situation where we have to not only examine the election, we have to also look at what's happening in the media. I'm not saying that there's something criminal is happening, but we have to find some balance again in the media, and we also have to find some balance again in the education system. And
Yeah, yeah,
that's something that is very hard. That's something that takes a lot of work, and something that takes a lot of time, because in order for people to get into prominent positions in those areas, that takes quite a lot of time.
yeah. Definitely so, definitely so.
Yeah. And of course, another issue here is a lot of the big tech industries and their censorship, uh, as well as their support for particular political positions. We're in a situation where a lot of wealthy people have a pretty significant political influence, and not a very verbose, not a very open political influence, but a very subtle political influence by the way that certain things are censored, by the way that certain information is made available. It's it's a relatively interesting place to be, I would say.
Yeah, the it's almost a little bit saddening, really, for me, especially this only being like this the first president I've been able to vote for. So to think that the whole process from now on could be super flawed is a little bit scary.
Yeah, and that's why the prosecutor, channel, someone I've interviewed, that he has the position that by Trump challenging this election, we will be in a position to challenge all of the other institutions that are corrupting us,
Right.
that are corrupting our system, that is, our political system.
Yeah, and I do think that his approach, as I said before, is very optimistic. And really, I hope that that's the true motive of what Trump is doing, and ultimately what's going to come out of what's going on now. If anything, I do think it's going to improve or, at the very least, expose more what's going on. So I guess whatever way you look at it, you could take a positive approach to what's going on. I would think.
Yes, because I think that when all this is over, in the ideal end state of what is happening now, what we want a situation where we know that our votes count, and that they don't count in a way that is corrupt. That is to say, that our votes count and they count legitimately. That when someone threatens our system, that person is dealt with in a legal way with due process. That when there's a question of someone taking a lot of power in society, that we have balance to prevent that power from being abused, and that we can rely on our mail, our USPS to be reliable. Those are things that we want. Those are securities that, if we're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we should want to have, essentially. That our system is reliable, that there's justice, that we don't have to worry about things going out of hand. We don't have to worry about abuses of power. So the goal is to get from where we are now to that point.
Of course, yeah. That I would hope that that's the ultimate goal for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I understand that obviously that's just an idealized position, that it could very well be that we'll never be in exactly that position. I understand that. But I think that certainly getting towards that position is something that is worth putting an effort in, because we don't take an approach to policing that if we don't succeed in eliminating all crime, we have failed in police. No, I think that the reason why we have the police is to reduce crime and to deal with crime. But that doesn't mean that we'll not have crime, but it does mean that we'll ideally reduce it.
Yeah, yeah.
So, do you have any particular opinion or something to ask in regards to the election?
Uh, Not particularly, because we kind of covered the main idea I had going into this, uh, with your general thoughts of the situation. But I guess the only thing I would kind of ask, and I'm not even sure if this is really going to happen, but do you think that uh, actual laws are going to change from this?
Actual laws changing from this situation? Well, I think if there is whatever happens, there certainly is an impetus. That is to say, a reason and incentive to ensure perhaps greater clarity on certain laws in certain places, and to perhaps ensure that justice is dealt with better. Now, whether that's actually going to lead to anything, I don't know. It depends on the legislature, because we can consider our government as a machine that operates on laws, but we also have to understand that our laws don't mean anything if we don't have people to enforce them and to produce them and to examine them. And so we have a machine with human elements, and because of that, we have to find a place where we can hold the human elements in that machine reliable. So in that sense, could there be laws? I think there certainly might be new laws. What exactly these laws are, I suppose it would depend on the state. There might be federal laws to standardize and streamline the issue so that this doesn't happen again. However, if Biden wins, and he wins in a very unopposed way, then we might have a situation where people say, well, it's good enough and we're not going to change anything. That might happen too. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if there's going to be any law changes. I could see state laws potentially changing if they almost get like embarrassed by the situation, or maybe a new legislator or something wants to pass something. But I don't necessarily see too much change from a law perspective happening.
Yeah. And what's interesting about the Biden's current position of president elect presumptive, I would say, presumptive president-elect, is that the first time I heard about it, because it took a couple of days for this to happen. The first time I heard about it was actually from someone in another country calling him up saying, congratulations, Biden won. And I'm thinking, well, not really a lot of congratulations on Biden, because as much as I don't like Trump, I don't like Biden more. So in that sense, it wasn't an interesting moment. And then I said, well, it's are you sure Biden won, is what I asked. And he said, yeah, of course. The media is saying it, everyone's saying it. And then I said, well, it's not that simple. And that's what this is about. It's not that simple. We still have two important days, and that is the actual election day in December and the inauguration day in January. And if there's anything of substance to these allegations, a lot can change between now and December, and a lot can change between then and January. So we're in a very interesting situation. And although I compared the situation to Bush v. Gore, I will say that it is not the most apt of comparisons, because as opposed to that situation where it was simply a question of voting counts and whether hanging chads were valid, we're now in a situation where there is allegation of widespread fraud on a very large scale. And that's something that is a lot scarier than Bush v. Gore, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think this has more at stake than Bush v. Gore or anything that's happened in the past, at least in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think another allegation, I suppose, if we're naming allegations, one was that there's a secret program or computer called Hammer with a scorecard application that could, in theory, be used to manipulate votes. Although I don't really know that much about it, so I'm not really going to say that that's something that I'm relying upon. What I'm more thinking about is the backdating of votes and the dumping of spoilt ballots. I think that's something that is much more substantial anyway. But you never know what could happen. There might be something that we haven't heard of that is found out. So I'm just putting that idea out there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd like to emphasize, in case any censors are watching this, I'm not saying that there is, and I've been very careful, I'm not saying that there is voter fraud or election fraud. What I am saying is that there are strong allegations and that those allegations merit investigation. Just to be very clear on the facts, in case YouTube is thinking of censoring me, that I'm not actually saying that there is fraud. What I am saying is that there are strong allegations and that those merit investigation, because I'm in favor of due process. I'm not in favor of accusing people before there is strong evidence that they may have committed a crime.
Yeah, that's why there's the whole system we have for juries and your.
Yeah, we have a due process. Yeah, yes.
There, the due process. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's very important.
Okay, so I think if you've got nothing more to say,
nothing I can think of. No.
Okay. Well, in that case, where can people find you?
You can find me on my YouTube channel, The Breakdown with Berckenhoff, and I also have a Twitch and D Live at The Breakdown with WB. And I'll do my podcast usually on Tuesdays or Thursdays. And I do some solo videos here and there on my YouTube. So you can always just kind of check out the YouTube. That's where all of my stuff comes up as far as that goes. I do have a BitChute, although I'm very slow at posting there, but I'm trying to get better with BitChute. But long story short, you can find me on any of those three platforms. And I hope to see you there.
Yeah, it's been great having you on. I hope you're doing well. Hope that whatever happens, the just man wins. I think that's the best thing that we can hope for. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Anavultus over and out.